The
I have
night
to go
Nora
now,
Calloway
but
ran
I promise
barefoot
I'll be
through the
back.
streets
But
of
why?
Eastside
Please don't
Akron,
leave me.
It's
she
not
was
safe for
not
you
running
here.
away
Hold on
from
to this
something.
photo.
She
I
was
will,
running towards
but come
someone.
back soon.
That
I will, I
distinction
promise.
mattered. It would always matter, because there is a difference between a child driven by panic and a child driven by purpose, and anyone who looked closely at those small feet moving across the cracked pavement that October night would have seen it. The set of her jaw, the direction of her eyes. She wasn't scanning for escape. She was navigating, calculating, moving toward a
Hey there.
specific
You shouldn't be out
destination
here
with the
alone.
kind of certainty
I know.
that most
I'm
grown
looking for
men
my
spend their
mom.
entire lives trying to find.
All right.
8 years
Stay
old,
here. We'll find her.
37 pounds, wearing pajama pants with little yellow stars on them and a sleep shirt 2 sizes too big. A torn backpack over one shoulder that held exactly 3 things: a library book she hadn't finished, her grandmother's rosary beads, and a flip phone so old it barely held a charge. Nora Calloway knew where she was going. She had known for longer than she'd ever admitted. The East Side neighborhood of Akron, Ohio sits in that particular American geography that politicians mention in speeches and never visit twice. It's the kind of place that was once something, a working neighborhood with corner stores and Catholic churches, and the kind of block parties where people actually knew each other's names. But decades of factory closings and budget cuts and willful neglect had worn it down to the bone. The storefronts now ran about half empty. The streetlights worked about half the time. The people who remained were the ones who couldn't leave and the ones who refused to, and sometimes it was hard to tell which category was which. On Garfield Street, just past the intersection where the light had been broken for 7 months, sat a club with no sign above the door. It didn't need one. Everyone in East Side knew what the building was. Everyone knew who owned it. Everyone knew that Colt Hargrove, the man they sometimes called the Hammer, though never to his face and rarely above a whisper, had a habit of sitting outside on quiet nights, just him and a cigarette, and whatever thoughts lived behind those steady gray eyes. Nora had seen him out there before, 3 times to be exact. She counted things, filed them away. Her grandmother called it being observant. Her teacher called it being a little too serious for her age. Nora just thought of it as paying attention, which seemed like the most obvious thing in the world to do, when the world kept trying to surprise you with things you should have already seen coming. She had seen Glenn Pruitt coming. She just hadn't known how to stop him. The story of Edna Calloway and her granddaughter began long before October, in the particular way that hard stories always begin, not with a single dramatic moment, but with an accumulation of small surrenders. Edna had lived in apartment 4C of the Riverside Arms for 11 years. She had moved in after her husband passed, after her daughter Nora's mother had left for reasons that Edna never explained, and Nora had learned not to ask about. The apartment was not beautiful. The pipes knocked in cold weather. The windows let in a draft no matter how much weather stripping Edna applied. The hallway always smelled faintly of something she could never quite identify. But the rent was fair, and the neighborhood knew her, and the laundromat 2 blocks away had given her a job without asking too many questions about age. Edna worked the early shift 5 in the morning until 11. She worked the late shift when they needed coverage, which was more often than not. She came home smelling of detergent and fabric softener, and she always stopped at the corner store for the specific orange juice that Nora liked, and she always hummed while she made dinner old songs, whose words Edna sometimes couldn't remember, but whose melodies she had carried across decades like something precious, wrapped in cloth. Nora had lived with Edna since she was 2. She didn't remember another home. She didn't think of it as a difficult life, though she understood from small signals the way Edna stretched a grocery budget, the way she patched rather than replaced, the way she sometimes sat at the kitchen table after she thought Nora was asleep, looking at bills with an expression that she never let her granddaughter see, that things were tight in ways that required constant management. Nora didn't mind. She loved the apartment. She loved the way morning light came through the south window and landed across the kitchen table in a long, warm stripe. She loved the smell of Edna's coffee and the sound of Edna's slippers on the linoleum and the particular quality of silence that settled over the apartment on Sunday afternoons when they had nowhere to be. She loved her grandmother with the fierce, uncomplicated certainty of a child who has found the one person in the world who makes everything feel stable. She would have done anything to protect that. Glenn Pruitt had arrived 3 months before the October night. He came with 2 duffel bags and a story about recently losing his job and needing a temporary room while he got back on his feet. He was 41, medium build, with a neck tattoo that Edna later described to Nora as looking like a snake trying to swallow itself. He paid his first month's rent in cash, counted out slowly and deliberately like a man establishing credit through the visible effort of payment. Edna had taken in a boarder twice before in her 11 years at Riverside Arms. Both times had worked out adequately. She was not naive about the arrangement, and she was not sentimental about it either. She needed the supplemental income. The laundromat hours had been cut. The rent had gone up. These were the equations of her life, and she solved them with whatever was available. The first month, Glenn was polite, quiet. He was gone most of the day and most evenings, appearing only to move through the small, shared spaces of the apartment in a way that seemed designed to take up as little room as possible. He said please and thank you. He kept his door closed. He nodded to Nora in the hallway and didn't try to engage beyond that, which was exactly the right amount of interaction from Nora's perspective. In the second month, there were signs, not dramatic ones, just the kind of incremental shifts that you almost dismiss as your own imagination because none of them individually would hold up as evidence of anything. Glenn started drinking in the evenings. Not heavily at first, just a beer or two in the kitchen, which was technically the shared space he was entitled to use. He started coming home later and louder. The politeness faded into something more perfunctory, a habit of courtesy no longer backed by any actual courtesy. He started asking about the rent 2 weeks early. The first time, Edna explained that she paid on the first of the month as agreed. Glenn nodded and dropped it. The second time, 10 days before the first, he pressed a little harder, mentioned that he had expenses that the first felt like a long way off. Edna reminded him they had an agreement. Glenn's eyes went somewhere flat and still, and then he smiled and said, "Of course you're right. Sorry to bother you." Nora watched these exchanges from the hallway, from behind the cracked door of her bedroom, from the particular angle of a child who has learned to be invisible when adults are navigating something she doesn't fully understand but knows to be important. She thought about Colt Hargrove more than once in those weeks. She filed that thought away too. In the third month, Glenn stopped bothering with pretense. The night it happened was a Thursday. Edna had worked a late shift and come home tired in the way that went beyond physical exhaustion into something that lived in the eyes. She made soup from what was in the cabinet, sat with Nora while she ate, listened to Nora read 3 pages of her library book aloud, and then tucked her in with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for years and still managed to make it feel unhurried. Nora was not asleep when the knock came. She was thinking about a word she'd found in her library book, tenacious. She liked the way it felt in her mouth. She liked what it meant more. Holding firmly to something, refusing to let go. She was turning the word over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by a river when Glenn's fist hit the apartment door. Not the front door of the building, the door of Edna's apartment, which meant he had already come inside, already crossed the threshold into the space Edna paid for and owned the right to, and was now treating it like it was his to bang on at 9:30 at night. Nora went still. Through the wall, she heard Edna's slippers on the linoleum, the click of the deadbolt. Glenn's voice rough with something that was not just alcohol. There was something sharper in it, something that had been building for weeks, demanding the rent early. All of it. Tonight, he had expenses. He had people he owed. He was not going to wait until the first. Edna's voice was steady. She explained the arrangement. She explained that she didn't have the full amount tonight, that she would have it in 3 days as she always did, that they had an agreement and she intended to honor it. Glenn's voice went somewhere else. Lower, more dangerous. The kind of low that isn't volume, it's pressure. Nora slipped out of bed. She moved to her door. The crack she kept there was not accidental. She had calibrated it over months to give her the exact angle she needed to see into the kitchen without being seen herself. What she saw was Glenn with his hand around her grandmother's wrist. Not a grab, a grip, the kind that communicates ownership. Edna said his name. Calm and firm, and with that particular authority of a woman who has been managing difficult situations for 7 decades and refuses to be undone by one more. Glenn's response was to pull her arm hard to the side. Edna stumbled into the kitchen counter. Her hand shot out to catch herself. A glass on the counter edge went over and hit the linoleum with a clean, sharp crack. Glenn stepped forward, his voice rising now. The low pressure becoming something louder. Uglier, the beer-thick demand for money turning into something that didn't need the money at all anymore. Something that just needed to be the one standing. Nora saw her grandmother's face. The pain there, the determined effort to hide it. She moved before she finished forming the thought. Not out the front door because Glenn was between her and it. She went to her window, the one that faced the alley on the north side of the building, the one she had opened 100 times in summer to let in the air. She went out onto the fire escape in her star-patterned pajamas, and her bare feet, the metal cold enough to hurt, but not enough to stop her. And she came down the stairs two at a time in the dark and landed on the alley pavement and ran. She did not run without direction. She turned left on Garfield Street. Nora had known about Colt Hargrove the way children in East Side knew about the particular geography of their world through the accumulated evidence of adult behavior. You learn what is dangerous and what is safe, not because anyone explains it, but because of where people's eyes go, what streets they cross to avoid what names they use, and what tone they use them in. Colt Hargrove's name was spoken in East Side in a tone that was not admiration and not fear exactly, but something that partook of both. He was 42 years old and had run the East Side operation since his early 30s, inheriting it from a man who had inherited it from another. The whole thing operating in that gray territory between organized crime and informal governance that exists in neighborhoods the city has otherwise abandoned. He moved the line on what was permissible and what wasn't according to a code that was his own, carved from something personal rather than conventional. No drugs sold to anyone under 25. No prostitution on his territory. No one put their hands on a woman or a child and remained walking afterward. These were not the rules of a man with illusions about what he was. They were the rules of a man who had very specific ideas about which lines he would not cross and what would happen to anyone who crossed them in his presence. The neighborhood talked about his grandmother, Pearl Hargrove, who had raised Colt after both his parents died within the same year, a winter that Colt had described to exactly no one, but whose shape could be read in certain silences. Pearl had worked 3 jobs. She had kept Colt in school and in shoes and in the particular kind of daily structure that keeps a grieving child from coming apart. She had loved him with the particular fierce practicality of a woman who knew that sentiment without action was just noise. Colt had been 29 when Pearl got sick. He had been in federal custody on an assault charge, a charge that stemmed from defending Pearl against a landlord who had put his hands on her during an eviction dispute when she deteriorated. The court had moved slowly. The appeals had gone nowhere. Pearl Hargrove had died in a room at St. Augustine Hospital without her grandson beside her, because the system that had failed her for decades had managed one final conclusive failure. Colt had walked out of that facility 13 years ago with the kind of grief that doesn't soften over time because you never allow it to. You keep it at the exact temperature of the day it arrived because softening it would feel like forgetting. And forgetting was not something you did about Pearl Hargrove. He was sitting on the low concrete step in front of the club on Garfield, cigarette in his left hand, when Nora appeared at the edge of the streetlight. Desmond, standing 3 steps to Colt's left, saw her first and started to move. Desmond was 38, tall and careful, Colt's second in 3 years, and the person Colt trusted most with the navigation of situations that required judgment over force. He had seen children in this street before, usually in circumstances that required sending them home. He moved now with the particular efficiency of someone managing a routine situation. Colt raised his hand without looking up. Desmond stopped. Colt had seen the child's walk from 20 yards away. He knew the difference between a child wandering and a child moving with intention. He'd seen that walk before, though, not on someone this small, and it made him go still in a way that had nothing to do with threat assessment. He put the cigarette down on the step beside him. Nora came to within 6 feet of him and stopped. Bare feet on November pavement, the torn backpack over one shoulder, a cut on the sole of her left foot leaving a small dark line on the concrete behind her. She was shaking but not crying, and that distinction was doing something to Colt's chest that he would not have been able to easily explain. She looked directly at him, not at Desmond, not at the 2 men in the doorway behind Colt, at him. "Are you a good man or a bad man?" she said. The street went very quiet. One of the men in the doorway shifted his weight. Desmond was absolutely still. Colt looked at this child, 8 years old, bleeding foot star pajamas. The whole improbable picture of her, and he felt something move in him that didn't have a simple name. He didn't answer the question. Not then. "What's your name?" he said instead. "Nora." "Where do you live, Nora?" "Riverside Arms, Garfield in 9th. She paused. Then, with the precision of someone delivering a report, "A man hurt my grandmother. She fell and she won't get up. I needed someone to help her." "What man?" "The man who rents the room, Glenn Pruitt. He smells like beer and he has a snake tattoo on his neck. He wanted money. She didn't have all of it yet." She paused again. "She would have had it by Friday." Colt looked at her for a long moment. not at the information she was conveying, at her. How did you know to come here? Nora's expression shifted just slightly, something that on an adult face would have been described as measured, the look of someone deciding how honest to be. Then she said, my grandmother told me about this street a long time ago. She said the man out front keeps the bad ones away. She told you to come here tonight. No, she doesn't know I left. Another slight adjustment in her expression. She would be upset about that, but I made a decision. Colt stood up. In the years since people in East Side would tell different versions of what happened next, the way stories accumulate embellishment, with each retelling until the truth and the legend press up against each other, so closely you can't quite find the seam between them. What the actual witnesses saw was simple. Colt Hargrove handed his cigarette to Desmond without looking. He said two words. Let's go, and walked to the black SUV parked at the curb. Desmond crouched briefly to Nora's level and said, you're going to ride with me. Okay, we're going to get your grandmother. Nora looked back at Colt, who was already at the vehicle, already starting it. He didn't answer my question, she said. Desmond looked at her for a moment. No, he said. He didn't. Nora considered this. Then she said, that's okay, I already know the answer, and walked to the SUV. The Riverside Arms had been built in 1964 and renovated never. Its facade held the particular exhaustion of a building that has been told it will be replaced for 20 years and has slowly started to believe it. The front door hung at an angle that required lifting and pushing simultaneously, a motion every tenant had internalized as automatic. The hallway had that deep ground-in smell of decades of human habitation in spaces with inadequate ventilation, a smell that was not exactly unpleasant, but was very specific to certain kinds of American buildings in certain kinds of American neighborhoods. Glenn Pruitt's music could be heard from the ground floor. Colt took the stairs at a pace that looked unhurried and covered them in less time than it should have. Desmond and Whitfield flanked him, Whitfield behind. Nora was in the SUV with the engine running. Desmond's specific and non-negotiable instruction, stay here, stay low, don't open the door for anyone but me or Colt. Nora had agreed without argument, which told Desmond something about the child that he filed away for later consideration. Apartment 4C, the door was not locked. It was not quite closed. Whether this was Glenn's carelessness or Edna's failure to close it behind herself, when she'd answered Glenn's knock, was not important. What was important was that Colt could see through the 3-inch gap the kitchen floor. Edna Calloway was not unconscious. She was sitting on the linoleum with her back against the cabinet under the sink, holding her side with both arms. The way people do when they're managing a pain they don't want to acknowledge is serious. Her gray hair had come loose on one side. Her glasses were on the floor beside her, one lens cracked. There was a bruise forming along her left cheekbone that was going to be significant by morning. She was awake, and she was watching Glenn Pruitt pace the kitchen, still talking, his voice having gone past anger into the repetitive loop of drunk grievance that circles the same few points over and over, finding no resolution, because resolution was never the point. Colt opened the door. Glenn turned. The change in the room was immediate and complete. Glenn's voice stopped mid-sentence. The pacing stopped. The alcohol-fueled momentum that had been carrying him drained out of him with a speed that would have been almost comical under any other circumstances. His face went through several expressions too quickly to fully inhabit any of them. Recognition, confusion, a brief flame of defiance quickly extinguished by something more honest. Colt Hargrove, Glenn said. His voice was trying for something it could not locate. Colt's eyes moved to Edna. That was all? He looked at her on the kitchen floor, at the bruise on her face, at the careful way she was holding her ribs, and whatever he had been before he walked in the door became something else. Something that ran deeper than professional operation. He had seen this before. He had seen this exact configuration of a woman on a floor and a man standing over her too many times to experience it as anything other than what it was. And underneath the operational response was the other thing, the older thing, the 13-year-old thing that never fully cooled his grandmother in a hospital room. A different floor, the same essential story. Step away from her, Colt said. His voice was not raised. That was the part people always mentioned afterward, always noted with a particular emphasis, the part that made the moment feel like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. He didn't need to raise it. Glenn stepped back one step. His hands went up partway, a reflex gesture toward non-aggression that didn't quite convince anyone, least of all himself. Look, this is between me and the old lady, Glenn started. About money. She owes me. She doesn't owe you anything, Colt said. He moved past Glenn as if Glenn was furniture and crouched beside Edna. Up close, the damage was worse. The cheekbone bruise was spreading. Her breathing was shallow in the way that suggested ribs rather than just the shock of the fall. He put his hand very gently on her shoulder, not grabbing, just contact, the kind that says, "I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." Edna looked at him. Her eyes were alert, still processing, moving through the confusion of who this man was and why he was here and what any of this meant. "Your granddaughter sent me," Colt said quietly. "She's safe. She's outside." Edna closed her eyes for 1 second, one long, relieved second. Then she opened them. "She ran," Edna said, her voice rough at the edges. "I told her if anything ever happened, she should run. She ran to the right place." Colt straightened and looked at Whitfield, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with the particular stillness of a man waiting for direction. He pulled out his phone and made a call that lasted 30 seconds. His personal doctor, an arrangement that operated well outside the standard healthcare system, a man who asked no questions and arrived quickly. The address, the injuries, the words, "This is family," which was the signal that meant whatever it cost was irrelevant. He turned back to Glenn. Glenn had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man recalibrating his options and finding the inventory short. He was backed against the refrigerator now, which was less a strategic position than where his body had ended up during its slow retreat from the room's altered gravity. "I didn't hurt her," Glenn said. "She fell." "She fell," Colt repeated. "I didn't touch her. We were having a disagreement and she fell. That's it. That's all that happened." Colt looked at the bruise on Edna's cheekbone. He looked at the cracked glasses on the floor. He looked at the particular angle at which Edna was holding her ribs, which was not the angle of someone who had fallen, but the angle of someone who had absorbed a blow. "You want to tell that story again?" Colt said. Glenn's mouth opened, then it closed. "I thought so," Colt said. What followed happened with the particular efficiency of men who have done this kind of thing before. Whitfield moved to the bedroom to collect Glenn's belongings without being asked. This was part of the understood choreography of these situations, the parallel process of ejection, while the principal conversation continued. Colt kept his focus on Glenn with the unwavering quality of a man who has nothing else requiring his attention. He told Glenn what was going to happen. The same words that had been said before in other apartments, in other circumstances, calibrated to this specific man and this specific failure. "You are leaving this building. You will not return. You will not contact this woman, her granddaughter, anyone associated with this address. You will take what you have in this apartment, and you will be out of the city by morning." Glenn tried twice more to find the angle that made this negotiable and found that it did not exist. The third time he began to speak, Colt held up one hand not aggressively, just a simple stop, and something in the economy of that gesture conveyed information that Glenn absorbed without further argument. "Get your bags," Colt said. Glenn got his bags. While Whitfield was in the bedroom and Glenn was performing the frantic archaeology of packing a life into 2 duffel bags under time pressure. Colt crouched again beside Edna. His doctor would be here in 20 minutes. In the meantime, he needed her as comfortable as possible, which meant moving her from the linoleum to the couch, which he did with a care that would have surprised anyone whose knowledge of him derived entirely from reputation. Edna allowed this. She was not a woman who accepted help easily, which Colt could read in the slight resistance, and then the deliberate choice to release it, the recognition of someone who understood that this was not the moment for independence. He settled her on the couch. He went to the kitchen and found a dish towel and put ice in it from the freezer and brought it back for her face. She held it to her cheekbone and looked at him. "How old is she?" Colt asked. 8, Edna said. He nodded once. Something moved across his face and was gone. "She'll want to see you," he said, "as soon as the doctor gives the okay." "Is she?" Edna's voice broke for the first time. "Is she frightened?" Colt thought about Nora in the SUV, about the way she'd walked up to him on the sidewalk, about the direct precision of her question. "Are you a good man or a bad man?" "No," he said. "She's not frightened at all." Edna released a long breath. The ice pack moved slightly as the tension in her body found somewhere else to go. "What's your name?" she asked. "Colt Hargrove." Something shifted in her expression. Not recognition exactly. Something more like proximity to recognition, like a word on the tip of the tongue. She looked at him for a moment longer than seemed accounted for by the situation, then lowered her eyes. "Thank you," she said. Glenn came out of the bedroom with one bag under his arm and one in his hand, his face red and sweating. His movements sharp with the particular agitation of a man who has been comprehensively defeated and is working very hard not to show it. Whitfield was behind him. Colt stood. He had one more thing to say to Glenn Pruitt before this was finished. He said it quietly, which meant the words required complete attention to receive. He told Glenn that the choice Glenn had made tonight to put his hands on a woman who could not fight back, to use strength as a substitute for character, was the most comprehensively wrong choice available to a man in any situation, in any context, on any night, and that Glenn was going to carry the specifics of this particular evening for the rest of his life. He was going to remember that an 8-year-old girl with bloody feet had more courage in 3 blocks of barefoot running than Glenn had ever assembled in 41 years of living. He was going to remember that. Glenn said nothing. He had gone very still. Whitfield took him downstairs. Colt stood in the apartment that still held the wreckage of the evening overturned chair, cracked glass on the linoleum, the ice pack in Edna's hand, the smell of spilled beer, and he pulled out his phone and called Desmond. "Bring her up," he said. He heard the car door in the background. A pause. Then Desmond's voice slightly bemused. "She was already at the bottom of the stairs, boss. Waiting." Nora came through the apartment door, still wearing Desmond's jacket, which went to her knees and covered her hands entirely. She walked straight to the couch without looking at Colt or Desmond or anyone else. She walked straight to her grandmother and climbed carefully onto the cushion beside her, fitting herself into the small space between Edna's arm and the couch back with the practiced efficiency of a child who has done this 10,000 times. Edna wrapped her arm around Nora, and Nora pressed her face against her grandmother's shoulder, and the two of them were quiet together for a moment that did not require any language. Colt turned away and walked to the window. Outside, the street was the ordinary street. It was, every night, the broken lamp at the corner betwixt the bodega still lit at 10 p.m., a cat moving along the sidewalk edge with its particular weightless precision. The city continued itself without commentary. Behind him, he heard Nora's voice muffled slightly against Edna's shoulder. "I told you he would help." Edna made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "You are so much trouble," she said softly and held Nora tighter. Colt's doctor arrived 17 minutes later. He was 60, efficient and constitutionally incapable of unnecessary conversation, which was why Colt had maintained their professional arrangement for 11 years. He examined Edna with the focused attention of someone who understands that his value in situations like this one is exactness rather than reassurance. The assessment was methodical and relatively quick. 2 cracked ribs, he said. Possible hairline fracture in the left cheekbone would need imaging to confirm. Mild concussion consistent with the described impact. She would need rest monitoring and probably 48 hours in a proper facility to confirm there was nothing he was missing. He looked at Colt. "St. Augustine. Private room," Colt said. "Best available." The doctor nodded and made the call. While this was happening, Nora sat beside Edna on the couch in Desmond's jacket and watched everything with those steady, attentive eyes. She watched the doctor. She watched Desmond by the door. She watched Colt at the window with the same expression she'd had when she'd first walked up to him on Garfield Street, not wary, not awed, just clear. Like she was seeing something she had expected to find. After the doctor stepped away to make arrangements, Nora looked at Colt and said, "Will she be okay?" "Yes," he said. And then, because it was true and because this child had earned the truth, "It's going to take a few weeks, but she'll be okay." Nora absorbed this. "Are you going to make sure Glenn doesn't come back?" "He's already gone." "But permanently?" Colt looked at her. "Permanently," he said. Nora nodded once, like someone checking an item off a list. Then she looked at the kitchen, at the overturned chair. The broken glass, the small pieces of disorder that an hour ago had been an ordinary kitchen, in an ordinary apartment, in an ordinary evening. "Someone should clean that up before she comes home," Nora said. Colt followed her gaze. He told Whitfield, who had returned from delivering Glenn to circumstances that would occupy him elsewhere for the foreseeable future, to take care of it. He made another call while Nora stayed close to Edna, his man who handled properties, who managed the less visible aspects of the East Side operation, who could identify a building's ownership structure and any pending legal or financial encumbrances on it by morning. He knew the Riverside Arms. He had known it for years. He knew the landlord, a man named Pollard, who lived in Fairlawn and collected rents through a property management company that collected fees through a subsidiary that was incorporated in Delaware for the specific purpose of making direct accountability difficult to locate. He knew the building was old and marginal and maintained with the minimum investment required to keep it technically habitable. He was about to know more. The ambulance came at 11:15. It was private, unmarked, efficient. The paramedics, both known to Colt through the operational infrastructure he'd spent years building, treated Edna with the care she deserved, which was more than she'd received from most official systems in her 73 years of navigating them. As they prepared to move her, Edna reached out and caught Colt's hand. Her grip was stronger than her size suggested. "Thank you," she said again, and then after a pause, "Don't do anything on my account that you'll regret." The words landed somewhere specific. "I won't," Colt said. Edna looked at him for a moment longer, that same proximity to recognition in her eyes, that sense of almost knowing something that wasn't quite accessible yet, and then she let his hand go and allowed the paramedics to do their work. Nora walked beside the stretcher to the elevator. She held Edna's hand the whole way. After the ambulance left, Colt stood in the apartment alone for several minutes. Desmond was in the hallway. Whitfield had begun the cleanup. The immediate situation was managed. The pieces were where they needed to be. But Colt was not ready to leave yet. He walked slowly through the apartment in the way he did when he was processing something moving without specific destination cataloging. It was a small space and it told a clear story, the story of two people making a careful, deliberate life out of constrained materials. The furniture was old but kept with pride. The windowsills held small plants in terracotta pots, each one healthy, each one evidence of someone paying attention. Nora's homework was on the kitchen table, a math worksheet half completed in a child's precise handwriting, pencil laid across it like she'd just stepped away and would be back in a minute. On the refrigerator, held by 4 different magnets, was a drawing. Crayon on construction paper, the way children draw 2 figures, one tall and one small, standing in what was probably meant to be a garden sun in the upper left corner. Both figures with enormous circular smiles. In the bottom right corner, in a child's careful printing, me and Grandma. Colt looked at it for a long time. He was still looking at it when Desmond came to the doorway and said quietly, "Whitfield found something." Whitfield was in the bedroom that Glenn had used. It was a mean little room, narrow window, water stain on the ceiling. The smell of 3 months of habitation by a man who did not treat shared spaces with care. The 2 duffel bags were gone. The drawers were empty, the closet cleared. But Whitfield had done what he always did in these circumstances, which was to check the places a man in a hurry wouldn't think about. The underside of the mattress, the back corners of the closet shelf, the space behind the radiator. Behind the radiator was a manila envelope, unsealed. Inside it, a single document, 3 pages folded in thirds on the letterhead of a law firm Colt didn't recognize. Voss and Associates Attorneys at Law, 1441 Commerce Drive, Akron, Ohio. He read it, standing beside the radiator, while Whitfield waited and Desmond stood in the doorway. It was a legal notice, addressed to Edna Calloway, tenant of Apartment 4, C. Riverside Arms, 1120 Garfield Street East. The language was formal and technically precise in the way legal language always is when it wants to be simultaneously clear and confusing. The substance was simple. She was in violation of her lease agreement. The specific violations cited were minor to the point of pretextual, a noise complaint from 3 months ago that Colt was certain had never been formally filed, a claim of unauthorized guest use of the building's common areas. The notice required her to respond within 15 days or vacate. The date on the notice was 3 days before tonight. Colt read it twice. He thought about Glenn Pruitt showing up 3 months ago with his 2 duffel bags and his carefully measured politeness. He thought about the escalation, gradual, deliberate pace. He thought about the legal notice dated 3 days ago sitting behind the radiator in Glenn's room. He thought about an old woman on her kitchen floor and the timing of everything. He handed the notice to Desmond. Desmond read it. His expression didn't change, which was how Desmond expressed significant things. "Voss and Associates," Colt said. "Find out who they work for. Tonight, first thing tomorrow." He looked around the room one more time, the water stain on the ceiling, the mean little window, the space that Glenn Pruitt had occupied for 3 months while executing whatever this was. "And find out who owns this building, not the property management company, whoever owns the management company." He walked out of the room and down the hallway and out of the building. Outside, the October air hit cold and specific. Desmond fell into step beside him. In the SUV, Colt sat for a moment before starting the engine. Through the windshield, the Riverside Arms looked the way it had always had, aging, tired, holding on. The building where an old woman had worked 2 jobs and kept small plants alive on her windowsills and held her granddaughter's whole world in 73 years of determined love. Desmond's phone buzzed. He looked at it, looked at Colt. "Pollard sold the building," Desmond said. "According to the county assessor's database, Sale recorded 4 months ago, he paused. To Meridian Development Group, LLC. Colt turned the key. The engine came on. 4 months ago, Colt said. The timing settled into place. Meridian had bought the building first, then placed Glenn as their instrument. They had owned it before Glenn ever knocked on Edna's door. Every step of the last 3 months had been orchestrated from the moment the sale closed. I'll have everything by 8 a.m., Desmond said. Colt nodded. He put the SUV in gear. He thought about the notice. 3 days before tonight. He thought about Glenn Pruitt's timed escalation. He thought about an 8-year-old girl in star pajamas who had appeared out of the dark and asked him a question he hadn't answered. He thought about Edna Calloway's eyes when she'd heard his last name. That proximity to recognition, that sense of almost knowing. He drove to St. Augustine Hospital and stayed in the parking lot until the light in room 412 went on. Then he drove back to Garfield Street and sat outside the building until 4 in the morning, because some things required a human presence, especially when there was no immediate threat to respond to. Because protection was not just an action performed in a crisis moment, it was a posture maintained over time. A decision repeated in the dark and the cold, when no one was watching and there was nothing specific left to do. Nora Calloway had run to him because an old woman had told her something about this street, had told her that the man out front kept the bad ones away. Colt sat in the dark with that knowledge and turned it slowly in his hands, like something whose full weight he was only beginning to understand. The question she'd asked him on the sidewalk, "Are you a good man or a bad man?" He'd seen it in her eyes when she'd said, "I already know the answer." He wondered what she knew that he didn't. He wondered if she was right. He wondered what it would cost him to find out. The building held its silence. Somewhere inside, two people he had not known this morning were sleeping, one in a hospital room with cracked ribs and a determination that had survived 73 years of difficulty, one on a borrowed couch in Desmond's too large jacket, both of them under a claim of protection that Colt had not planned to make and did not know how to take back. He wasn't sure he wanted to. He sat in the dark until the first pale light came over the east end of Garfield Street, and then he drove away. The light in room 412 at St. Augustine Hospital was the particular yellow-white of institutional fluorescence, the kind that flattens everything. It touches and makes even healthy people look like they're being processed rather than cared for. Edna Calloway had been in this light for 2 days before she stopped noticing it, which was how she had always handled circumstances she could not change. She simply redirected her attention to the things that mattered and let the rest go soft in her peripheral vision. What mattered was that Nora was here. Twice a day, morning and after school, Desmond's car pulling up to the hospital entrance with Nora in the back seat, backpack over her shoulder, library book under her arm. The nurses on the 4th floor had learned her name by the 2nd visit. By the 3rd, they were leaving an extra chair by the bed without being asked. Nora did her homework on the rolling tray table, while Edna rested the scratch of pencil on paper, the kind of quiet that was better than silence. She read aloud when Edna asked, continued the library book they had started before the night. Everything changed, her voice steady and careful around the longer words, occasionally stopping to ask what something meant with the focused curiosity of a child who treats every unknown as solvable rather than overwhelming. In the evenings, she went back to the Riverside Arms. The apartment was not the same apartment she had left through the fire escape window. Colt's men had been through it in the 2 days following the incident with the particular thoroughness of people who understood that transformation is not just about removing what was wrong, but about asserting what should be. The linoleum had been cleaned until it held no memory of that night. The broken glass was gone. New furniture had appeared, not ostentatious, not charity conspicuous, just good and solid and carefully chosen to fit the space. A new kitchen table, 2 chairs, a lamp for the corner that had always been too dark. The window drafts had been addressed with new weather stripping and caulk applied by someone who knew what they were doing. The small plants on the windowsills had been watered and moved to catch better light. Nora had stood in the doorway the first time she saw it and not moved for a long moment. Then she had gone to the refrigerator and confirmed that the drawing was still there. The 2 figures, the crayons Sunmi and Grandma held by the same 4 magnets, untouched in the reorganization of everything around it. She had unpacked her backpack, sat down at the new kitchen table, and finished her math worksheet. On the 3rd day, Colt came to the hospital. He came in the afternoon and after Nora's school visit when the floor was quieter, and Edna was between the particular exhaustion of the first days and the restless frustration of a woman whose body was forcing stillnesses on someone not constitutionally designed for it. He came without announcement, which Edna found out later was simply how Colt moved through the world, appearing where he decided to be rather than negotiating his arrivals in advance. He knocked once on the door frame of room 412 and waited. Edna looked up from the window she'd been staring at and said, "Come in." Because whatever she had thought about this man, in the abstract, he had earned at minimum the consideration of an open door. Colt came in. He was in a dark jacket, no tie, the kind of clothes that were neither casual nor formal, but occupied a specific functional territory between them. He carried two coffees from the machine in the hospital lobby and set one on the bedside table near her without asking whether she wanted it, which was either presumptuous or perceptive, depending on what kind of mood you were in. Edna decided it was perceptive. "How are the ribs?" he asked, settling into the chair near the window. "Annoying," she said. "Everything I do reminds me they're there." "That'll be a few weeks." "So the doctor tells me," repeatedly. She looked at him for a moment. "Nora says you drove her to school this morning." "Desmond did." "She says you were in the car." Colt did not confirm or deny this. He looked out the window at the hospital parking lot below the grid of vehicles and the small moving figures between them and then back at her. "She's doing okay," he said, "in case you were going to ask." "I was going to ask." "She's doing okay. Better than okay, probably." A slight pause. "She's been asking Desmond questions about the building codes for commercial properties in Akron. He's not entirely sure how to handle it." Edna made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but contained everything necessary for one. She reached for the coffee and held it, not drinking, just warming her hands. She looked at Colt Hargrove, really looked at him the way she had been avoiding doing since he first appeared in her hospital room 2 days ago, because the looking had kept catching on something she couldn't quite name, and she had needed the time to locate what that something was. She had found it at 2 in the morning of the previous night. She had been lying awake with her ribs into aching and her mind doing the inventory it always did when the dark gave it space to run, and she had placed the name at last. Had placed it within the particular geography of memory, located the specific year, in the specific circumstances, and had lain there, with the knowledge of it until morning came. She decided she had carried it alone long enough. "I need to tell you something," she said. Colt looked at her. He didn't say anything, just shifted his attention in that way he had fully, without the partial engagement of someone waiting to respond. He simply listened. "Hargrove," Edna said. "I knew that name before I met you." Something changed in his expression. Not dramatically, just the kind of minute adjustment that happens when a word lands in exactly the right place. Edna set the coffee down. She looked at her hands, the hands that had processed other people's laundry for 11 years, that had tucked in 100 of Nora's bedtimes, that had made something adequate out of materials the world considered insufficient. "Pearl Hargrove," she said. The room went very quiet. "She was a customer at my laundromat for almost 4 years, Edna said. Starting about 16 years ago, maybe 17. Came in on Tuesdays and sometimes Thursdays. Always the early shift, always paid in exact change. Always folded everything herself instead of leaving it for the drop-off service, even though we offered it at no extra charge." She paused. She said folding was something she did for herself, that she found it clarifying. Colt was absolutely still. "We talked," Edna said. "Over those years, the way you talk to someone you see regularly in a small space, not conversations you plan, just the ones that happen between tasks, between machines in the natural pauses of a morning. You learn people that way, sometimes more honestly than you do in deliberate conversations, because nobody's performing anything. They're just there." She looked at Colt carefully. "She talked about her grandson," Edna said. "Not often, but when she did, she was very specific. She said he had a good heart and a short fuse, and that the world had given him reasons for both. She said he was in a situation that broke her heart to think about, and that she had run out of ways to help him from the outside." Edna paused. "She didn't say where he was. She said he was away." I understood what she meant. Colt's hands resting on his knees were very still. "She got sick fast," Edna said. "The way it sometimes goes with people who have been running on determination for so long, that when the determination finally has to rest, everything else rests with it. By the time I understood how sick she really was, there wasn't much time." Edna looked at the window. "She died in March, 13 years ago this spring. I was there." The words landed in the room and did not disperse. "There were 11 people at the service," Edna said quietly. "I knew 3 of them by sight from the neighborhood. There was a pastor and a woman from her church and a few others. No family." She stopped. "I stayed after. I helped fold the folding chairs. It seemed like the right thing to do. Colt leaned forward and put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. He sat like that for what felt like a long time. The hospital moved around them, the distant sound of a cart in the hallway, the muffled PA system, the ordinary machinery of a building processing human difficulty at scale. But the room they were in felt set apart from all of that. When he finally looked up, his eyes were at the precise intersection of grief and something else, something that looked like relief. The specific relief of receiving information you didn't know you needed and only recognize as necessary when it arrives. She didn't die alone, he said. His voice was not quite steady. No, Edna said. She didn't. Colt stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room looking out at the parking lot, and Edna gave him that time because she was 73 years old and understood that some things require a moment of privacy, even in shared spaces. When he turned back, he had recalibrated into something that was not quite what he'd been before. More settled, maybe? Like something had been located and returned to the place it belonged. She would have liked Nora, he said. Edna's expression softened into something that carried years in it. Yes, she said. She would have liked her very much. They sat together in the yellow-white light of room 412 and drank the bad hospital coffee and talked for an hour in the way that Edna had described between things in the natural pauses without performance. Edna told him about the laundromat. Colt told her nothing about his specific operations, and Edna did not ask, which was its own kind of conversation. They talked about the neighborhood, about Akron's particular history of being a city that kept surviving its own eulogies, about small plants and unreliable windows, and the specific domestic calculus of a life made from constrained materials. Colt told her about the apartment, that the work was ongoing, that she would come home to something better than she'd left. Edna said she was not a woman who took charity easily. Colt said this wasn't charity. He was correcting a situation that should not have been allowed to deteriorate in a building that was now under different management. He said it without elaboration, and Edna understood there was a great deal of information compressed in that particular sentence, and she made the decision to accept the compression rather than unfold it. Before he left, she caught his eye. Nora chose you, she said. I want you to understand what that means. She doesn't choose carelessly. Colt stood at the door. I know, he said. Do you? He thought about a child walking up to him on Garfield Street in the dark. The set of her jaw, the direction of her eyes, the precise, unhurried way she had said, I already know the answer. I'm beginning to, he said. On the fifth day, Desmond's morning report arrived before the coffee. Colt was in his office at the back of the club, the room where actual decisions got made, as opposed to the front-of-house performance of authority. And Desmond came in with his phone face up on the table, and his expression doing the thing it did when the information was significant. Meridian Development Group, LLC, had been registered in Ohio 14 months ago. The registered agent was a law firm in Columbus. The beneficial owner, after 2 layers of holding structure, the kind of layering that required a specific intent to obscure, was a regional real estate development consortium with documented projects in 7 Ohio cities. Their standard operating pattern, as best as Desmond had been able to construct from public records property filings, in a conversation with someone who owed Colt a significant favor at the county assessor's office, was consistent. Identify undervalued urban residential properties, acquire them quietly through intermediaries, then apply systematic pressure on remaining long-term tenants to vacate before triggering the formal development approval process. The pressure in several documented cases had involved exactly the kind of techniques employed at the Riverside Arms, placing a difficult tenant adjacent to the target before the sale even closed, using the pre-acquisition period to establish the instrument, escalating the situation to actionable levels, then using the resulting disruption to generate lease violation claims once ownership transferred. The sequence was deliberate. Glenn Pruitt had been positioned 4 months ago, 1 week before Meridian's purchase of the building was recorded. He was the advance work put in place, so the machine would already be running by the time the paperwork cleared. Glenn Pruitt's name did not appear in any of the documents Desmond had found. His fingerprints were on the method, not the paperwork. That was also consistent with the pattern. How many buildings, had Colt asked? In Akron confirmed 4, probably more. And Edna's lease? Desmond pulled up the relevant section. Edna Calloway's lease at the Riverside Arms was a full-term document signed in 2012 before the Ohio Urban Development and Tenant Protection Amendments of 2014 had been enacted. Under the amended statute, leases of this type, signed before the amendment's effective date and maintained without substantive default, carried specific protections that could not be waived by subsequent property sale or change of management. The Voss and Associates notice was legally incoherent if the 2014 protections applied, which they did. Colt read the relevant statute language twice. He handed Desmond's phone back. "Who's the attorney for the 2014 analysis?" he said. "You want someone outside the usual?" "A real estate litigator, someone who knows tenant protection law in this state and doesn't have any reason to be cautious about Meridian." Desmond wrote it down. He started to leave, then stopped. "There's one more thing," he said. Colt waited. Voss filed the notice through Meridian's registered address, but the instruction to file came from a separate party. Desmond looked at his phone. "There's a name on the internal correspondence that the assessor's contact pulled. A local attorney named Calloway. Howard Calloway." The name sat between them. Colt said nothing. Desmond said, "Same last name as—" "I know," Colt said. He stood at his desk and looked at the wall where he kept nothing decorative, only functional, and thought about Edna Calloway's estranged son and what it meant that this particular man had instructed this particular filing against this particular woman. He thought about the specific quality of cruelty that required a generation of context to fully understand. He said, "Don't tell Edna yet." Desmond nodded and left. Nora Calloway knew more than she was supposed to know. This was not exactly news to anyone who had spent more than 40 minutes in her presence, but the specific contours of what she knew and how she had come to know it were still emerging the way things do when you are watching a child and realizing that what you interpreted as passive observation was actually something much more active. It was Desmond who first understood the shape of it. He had been driving Nora to school on the fourth morning, Colt in the passenger seat, as Edna had accurately reported when Nora had said from the back seat without preamble, "The legal notice in Glenn's room. Did you read all 3 pages?" Desmond had glanced in the rearview mirror. Colt had turned slightly. "The violations listed on page 2, Nora said. The noise complaint. I looked it up. Our building has a physical complaint log in the front office. Mrs. Danworth, who manages the office, keeps it on a clipboard under the counter. I've seen it. There's nothing from the last 12 months about apartment 4C. The complaint they cited in the notice doesn't exist." Silence from the front seat. "Also," Nora said, "the notice was dated 3 days before the night Glenn hurt Grandma, but the envelope it was in wasn't sealed, which means it was put behind the radiators after it was printed, which means it was always meant to be found." She looked out the window at passing Akron. "I think someone wanted you to find it as a warning." Desmond had said nothing. He was not sure what to say. He had looked at Colt, who was looking at Nora in the visor mirror with an expression that contained something he was still working out how to classify. Later that morning, Colt had told Desmond to ensure that Nora was never under any circumstances left unattended in a situation she hadn't explicitly chosen to be in, not for reasons of threat, for reasons of professional respect. Desmond had understood. On the 5th afternoon, Nora came to the hospital and found Edna more alert than the previous days, the specific alertness of recovery, where the body has finished the immediate crisis management, and the mind reasserts itself with something close to impatience. Edna was sitting up the tray table, moved aside, her hands in her lap. She had combed her hair. She had asked for her glasses, the spare pair from her bedside drawer at home, which Nora had brought on the second day. They read for an hour. They talked about school, about a girl in Nora's class who had said something unkind about the school library books being for babies, about Nora's considered and apparently quite composed response to this, which had involved neither argument nor retreat, but a specific observation that had caused the other girl to change the subject. Edna had said, with the particular pride of someone watching a thing they worked hard to grow, "What did you tell her?" Nora had thought for a moment. "I said people who call things babyish are usually just afraid they'll like them." Edna had laughed, actually laughed, the first full one since the hospital, which hurt her ribs and was worth it. They were still in the comfortable aftermath of that when the door opened. Howard Calloway was 51 years old and carried himself with the specific posture of a man who had spent 3 decades convincing rooms that he was the most competent person in them. He was tall, well-dressed, in the professional, casual way of an attorney who has learned that the right close telegraph authority without aggression. His face had the structure of someone who had been conventionally handsome and had allowed age and something harder than age to change the quality of it. He did not knock. He came in the way men come into rooms they have already decided belong to them. Not rudely, but with a certainty about entitlement that makes the failure to ask permission feel like a technicality rather than a breach. He looked at Edna. He did not look at Nora. "Mother," he said. The word was correct and empty. Edna's expression changed. Nora watched it change, watched the specific sequence of recognition, then the brief involuntary hope that occurs in estrangement when a familiar face appears, then the harder thing that came after hope when the face looked like this. Howard, Edna said, I heard you were hurt. I'm recovering. Good. He moved further into the room, stopping near the foot of the bed, a position that was not close enough to be warmth and not far enough to be distance. The in-between place of a man who wanted the appearance of concern without its requirements. I need to talk to you about some things, about the apartment. This isn't the time for that conversation, Edna said. I think it might be exactly the time. His voice carried the practiced modulation of someone who has spent years presenting arguments in rooms designed to evaluate them. You were hurt in that building. The building is in poor condition. You're 73. You've been working double shifts for years. He paused. There are better options, safer options. There are care facilities. I'm not going to a care facility, Edna said, and that are designed for people in your situation. My situation, Edna repeated. An elderly woman living alone with a child, financially precarious, in a neighborhood that is my home, Edna said. In a neighborhood that is my home. Howard set his briefcase on the chair by the window, the chair where Colt had sat that morning, and opened it. He took out a document of several pages and placed it on the bed near Edna's hands. This is a lease termination agreement, he said. It's been drafted to provide you with a resolution payment, a reasonable sum given the circumstances, in exchange for vacating the apartment by December 1st. That's 6 weeks. He gestured toward the document. It's a fair arrangement. More than fair. Edna looked at the document. She did not pick it up. Who drafted this, she said. Howard was quiet for exactly 1 beat too long. My office, he said. Edna looked at the document for a long moment. She thought about the legal notice Colt had mentioned, the Voss and Associates letterhead, the non-existent noise complaint. She thought about the name Calloway on a filing related to Meridian. She had not told Colt she had made this connection. She had been sitting with it since 2 in the morning, turning it over in the dark, hoping the arithmetic would come out differently. It hadn't. Your office, Edna said, representing Meridian Development Group. Something shifted behind Howard's eyes. Barely perceptible. The micro-adjustment of a man whose preparation has met a variable he didn't adequately account for. The relevant parties aren't important, he said. I think they're the most important thing, Edna said. I think a man who instructs a filing against his own mother's home and then sends a man like Glenn Pruitt to apply pressure before the paperwork is even served has made himself the most important thing in the room. Howard's composure held, but its quality changed the difference between a wall and a wall under pressure. He looked at Edna with something she had not seen from him in 15 years of estrangement. He looked at her with the particular wariness of a man who has underestimated someone and knows it. Mother, don't call me that right now. The room held a silence that was doing a great deal of work. Howard looked at the document and then at Edna, and then made a decision that Nora could see him make, could see in the small straightening of his posture, the subtle shift of a man moving from one tactic to another. There's the question of Nora, he said. Edna went very still. You're 73 with cracked ribs in a hospital bed, Howard said. His voice was measured the tone of someone presenting a logical argument rather than a threat, which was a particular variety of threat Edna recognized, and Nora from the doorway of her bedroom throughout her life had been learning to name. The girl's mother has been gone for 6 years. You have no formal legal status as her guardian. There's no document, no court order, just a de facto arrangement that has never been formalized. He paused. That's a precarious position for both of you. Edna's hands were on the document, but not on it, above it, suspended. If there were a question raised about the adequacy of her living situation, about the safety of the environment, the stability of her care, stop, Edna said. I'm trying to help you understand the full picture. Stop, she said again. Her voice was quiet and it was iron. Howard looked at her. He looked at the unsigned document. He made another calculation. The deadline on the agreement is December 1st, he said. I'd encourage you to give it serious consideration. He picked up his briefcase, adjusted his jacket, moved toward the door with the efficiency of a man who has completed a scheduled task. He had not once acknowledged Nora, not once turned to look at her, the child sitting 3 feet from him, who held equal stake in every word he had just said. Howard reached the doorway. Nora said, I know what you did. He stopped. She was still seated in her chair beside the bed. The library book closed in her lap, her hands resting on its cover. She was looking at Howard Calloway with the same expression she'd had on Garfield Street, not hostile, not afraid. Clear. The look of a child who has made an assessment and is ready to report it. I know about Meridian, Nora said. I know Glenn was working for them. I know the noise complaint in the notice doesn't exist. I know the notice was left where someone would find it. She paused, and I know who told them to file it. Howard stood absolutely still. His face had gone through something not quite guilt, not quite surprise, but something in the neighborhood of both. Something that happens when a person confronting a child expects the softness of inexperience and finds instead a precision that has no age. You're 8 years old, he said. Yes, Nora said, and I know who knows it now. The door was already open. Howard Calloway walked through it without saying another word. His footsteps went down the hallway and into the elevator, and then the building absorbed him, and he was gone. Nora turned back to her grandmother. Edna was looking at her with an expression that contained several things at once: fear that had not entirely passed, pride that had not yet sorted itself out, and the particular exhausted love of a woman who has raised a child to be extraordinary and finds that the extraordinary is genuinely startling when it arrives in full. Nora, she said. I'm okay, Nora said. That man, he's not going to do anything. She said it with the certainty of a child who had made a calculation and trusted the result. He knows I told someone, and he doesn't know how much someone knows. Edna looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. The fluorescent light fell across them both. Outside in the hallway, the ordinary machinery of the fourth floor continued itself. How much does someone know? Edna asked carefully. Nora opened her backpack. She reached into the interior pocket, not the main compartment, but the small flat one that ran along the back, the one nobody ever checked, and she took out Edna's old flip phone. The one so old it barely held a charge. The one Nora had been carrying since the night she'd packed her backpack to run. She held it up. I took pictures, she said, before Whitfield picked up the envelope. I took pictures of everything inside it, all 3 pages. Edna stared at the phone. The phone has a camera, Nora said. It's not a good camera, but it works. Edna closed her eyes, opened them. When did you? While Colt was talking to Glenn, Nora said. After Whitfield went to pack his bags, but before he came back to the room. I had about 4 minutes. She set the phone on the tray table. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't know yet what it was for. I thought it was better to wait until I understood what I had. Edna looked at the phone on the tray table, then at her granddaughter. Then she started to cry. Not the suppressed crying she'd been managing since the hospital, the controlled release valve of a woman maintaining function under pressure, but something fuller, something that had been waiting for a moment that felt equal to it. The kind of crying that acknowledges the weight of what has been carried and the specific relief of not having to carry it alone. Nora climbed carefully onto the edge of the hospital bed and leaned against her grandmother's side, avoiding the ribs, and Edna held her with the arm that was freer, and they sat like that in the yellow-white light while the hospital moved around them. You're so much trouble, Edna said against Nora's hair. I know, Nora said. Colt arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after Desmond's phone buzzed with a text from a number that Desmond had set to alert level. He had been across town when it came. He drove with the focused efficiency of a man who has decided where he's going and removed every other consideration from the process. Desmond met him at the elevator. Howard Calloway was here, Desmond said. He tried to get Edna to sign a voluntary lease termination, threatened custody of Nora as leverage. He paused. He left without the signature. Edna told him she already knew about Meridian. Colt's jaw was working, and Nora told him she had evidence and that she'd already shared it. Desmond continued. He left. Is Edna okay? Shaken. More okay than you'd expect. Colt started toward the hallway. Desmond kept pace. There's something else, Desmond said. He relayed what the charge nurse had told him, what Nora had told the charge nurse to tell him specifically in case he arrived before Nora had a chance to speak to him directly. He listened to it. He listened to all of it. The flip phone, the interior pocket, the 4 minutes while Whitfield was in the bedroom. He stopped walking. Desmond stopped beside him. Colt looked at the hallway in front of them. A nurse moved past with a cart. An orderly walked in the opposite direction. The 4th floor of St. Augustine Hospital continued its ordinary functions around 2 men standing still. She photographed the documents, Colt said. The night it happened, before we even knew what they were. She's been carrying the phone since. Yes. Colt started walking again. His pace was not faster or slower than before. His expression was not more or less controlled. But something in the composite of him had shifted the way the landscape changes when the light hits it from a different angle. The same elements, the same geography, but the shadows falling differently. He stopped in the doorway of room 412. Edna was in the bed, composed now. The aftermath of the harder emotions settled into something quieter. Nora was in the chair beside her, the library book open on her knee, but she was not reading. She was looking at the door. She looked at Colt when he appeared. He looked at her. "You kept the phone," he said. "Yes," she said. "The whole time?" "Yes." He came into the room and took the chair on the other side of the bed and sat in it. Nora held out the flip phone across Edna's blanket. Colt took it. He opened it and found the photos, 12 of them, taken in the ambient light of Glenn's bedroom. The images grainy and angled, but legible. The 3 pages of the notice. The letter header. The full signature block at the bottom of page 3. And there at the bottom right corner of page 2, visible in the third photograph, the kind of detail that required knowing what you were looking for, a small notation in the document's footer. A client reference code followed by initials. HC. Colt looked at it for a long moment. He closed the phone and held it in his palm, feeling its weight, the weight of everything it contained. "You said you didn't know what it was for yet," he said to Nora, "when you took these." "Right, but you took them anyway." "My grandma always says, keep what you find until you know what it's worth." Nora looked at him with those steady eyes. "I thought it might be worth something." Colt looked at Edna. Something passed between the two adults. Not a conversation, just the compressed acknowledgement of people who understand each other. Then he looked back at the phone in his hand, at the 12 photographs that a child had taken with 4 minutes in an old flip phone in the dark. He thought about Glenn Pruitt's calibrated escalation. He thought about the Voss filing and the Meridian ownership structure and Howard Calloway's briefcase open beside the hospital bed. He thought about the full shape of what had been constructed against these two people and how long it had been in the making. He thought about Nora walking up to him on Garfield Street and asking him a question he still had not fully answered. "This is enough," he said, not to the room, to himself mostly, a final taking of measure. "Enough for what?" Nora asked. "To make sure your grandmother keeps her home." He put the phone in his jacket pocket carefully, the way you carry something that has earned specific treatment. "I'm going to give this to someone who knows what to do with it." Nora studied him. A lawyer. Someone who knows the law and isn't afraid to use it against people like Meridian. She considered this. "Will it take long? A few weeks? Maybe a little more?" Nora nodded, processing the timeline with the focused practicality of someone accustomed to working within constraints. Then she picked up her library book and found her page and read for a moment, and then, without looking up, she said, "My grandma told me about Pearl." The name in the room. Colt was still. "She told me about the laundromat," Nora said, "and the folding chairs." She turned a page, though she was not reading now, just maintaining the motion while she said the rest of what she wanted to say. "I think she was trying to tell me that the world is smaller than it looks, that things connect in ways you don't understand until later." She looked up, met his eyes. "I think she was right," Nora said. Outside the 4th floor window, Akron moved through its late afternoon in the specific way of Midwestern cities in autumn, the light going golden and thin, the trees along Commerce Street in their final week of color, before the gray season took over the traffic on the bridge below, moving with the unhurried rhythm of a city that had been revised by difficulty and kept going anyway. Colt sat with the weight of the phone in his pocket and the weight of everything that had led to this room, the years, the losses, the choices, the particular chain of events that had put an 8-year-old girl on Garfield Street at 10 p.m. on an October night and caused her to choose him from all the available options. He thought about Pearl Hargrove folding laundry on Tuesday mornings in a place where she was known, where someone would notice if she stopped coming. He had not been there. He had not been able to be there. That was a door that did not open from the inside. But he was here now, in this room, with the phone in his pocket and the photographs on it and the work that remained. He was here now, and that was the thing he could do. He stayed until Desmond brought dinner from the Italian place on West Market that Nora had mentioned in passing 3 days ago, that she liked the breadsticks there, and Desmond had filed that detail the way he filed all useful details. And now there were breadsticks on the rolling tray table, and 3 people and a recovering woman making space around a hospital bed, in the way families do, in the way that has nothing to do with paperwork or blood, and everything to do with showing up. Nora ate her breadstick with both hands and read a paragraph from the library book aloud, and did not look like a child who had stared down a threat that morning, or a child who had carried secret evidence for 5 days in the interior pocket of her backpack, or a child who had made a series of consequential decisions under pressure with the composure of someone decades older. She looked like a child eating dinner with people she trusted. which Colt thought was exactly what she was. He stayed until the visiting hours announcement came over the fourth floor, PA gentle and recorded, and followed by the sound of other rooms beginning their quiet goodnights. He stood pocketed the flip phone, again confirmed with Desmond the morning schedule. Edna caught his eye as he moved to the door. "You'll come tomorrow," she said. Colt had a full day of commitments tomorrow. He had 3 meetings that couldn't be moved and 2 situations that required his direct management in approximately no available hours. "Yes," he said. Edna nodded the nod of a woman who had gotten the answer she expected. Nora was already reading again, the light from the bedside lamp falling across the open pages, her lips moving slightly with the difficult words the way they did when she was fully in the text, fully somewhere else, fully herself. Colt stood in the doorway for one moment, looking at the room, at these 2 people, and the small warm lamp and the drawing on the imagined refrigerator back on Garfield Street, the 2 figures, the crayon sun, the enormous circular smiles. He went out into the hallway. He had calls to make, a lawyer to contact with specific expertise in Ohio tenant protection law, and no professional reason to move carefully around Meridian Development Group. A property transaction to complete the one he'd set in motion 3 days ago and had been managing in the background of everything else. A message to compose for a contact at the FBI field office in Cleveland, one that would arrive anonymously and would not be traceable to him, containing information about a pattern of systematic tenant displacement fraud across multiple Akron properties. He had work to do. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood in the corridor with his hands in his pockets, one hand around the flip phone feeling its small weight, and he thought about Pearl Hargrove folding laundry on a Tuesday morning. He thought about what it meant that the world had been small enough to put the woman who witnessed her last year in the same city, the same neighborhood, the same building, as the night Colt finally did what he had spent 13 years failing to do in time. He did not have a name for what that was. He was not sure it required one. The elevator arrived. He stepped in. The doors closed. The attorney's name was Carver Oakes, and he had spent 22 years doing exactly one thing, finding the places where Ohio's tenant protection laws had teeth and biting down on behalf of people the system had otherwise decided to overlook. He was 63, lean with the particular energy of a man who had converted personal outrage into professional fuel so long ago that the two were now indistinguishable from each other. He had gone up against developers, municipalities, banks, and insurance companies. He had never lost a case involving the 2014 Tenant Protection Amendments. He had also, in the specific way of men who operate at the intersection of law and justice, and find those territories only partially overlapping, done occasional work for Colt Hargrove over a period of years. Not criminal defense. Colt had different arrangements for that. Oakes handled the other category, the situations where the law was actually on the right side and needed someone to stand in front of it clearly and without apology. He came to the club on a Wednesday morning with a leather briefcase and a yellow legal pad and spent 2 hours at the back table with the photographs from Nora's flip phone laid out in front of him in order. He did not ask how the photographs were obtained. He asked precise questions about dates, about the property transaction, timeline, about the notice violations, about Edna's original lease document, which Colt had obtained through Desmond's contact at the county records office in the form of a certified copy. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment in the way of a man running calculations. "The notice is void," he said. "Edna Calloway's lease was signed in 2012 under terms that fall entirely within the protected category under the 2014 amendments. The violations cited are not substantiated. The noise complaint has no corresponding entry in the building's formal log, which I will subpoena within 48 hours if Meridian doesn't move first." He paused. "The HC initialing on the document footer is going to be interesting to explain in a deposition." "How long?" Colt said. "To resolve it, Meridian will settle before it gets to a courtroom." They always do. They're not stupid. They know what discovery looks like when someone actually goes looking. "I'd estimate 3 weeks to a formal withdrawal of the notice, plus a signed covenant not to pursue further action against this tenant." He looked at Colt. "Plus attorney's fees, which I'll require them to cover." Colt nodded. Oakes gathered the photographs carefully. He had made his own copies, but he returned the originals to the envelope they'd arrived in. "The FBI referral you mentioned," he said. "If that moves forward, it potentially exposes the pattern across all 4 properties. That changes things significantly for Meridian." "It'll move forward," Colt said, "through channels that don't lead back to you, through channels that lead to the right result." Oakes considered this. He was one of the few people who spoke to Colt without either deference or performance, and Colt had always valued that about him. The child took these photographs, Oakes said. It was not quite a question. Yes? 8 years old. Yes? Oakes was quiet for a moment. You know what the best evidence in most of my cases is, he said. People who notice things that other people have decided they don't need to notice. We spend a lot of years training that out of children. He picked up his briefcase. Good that someone didn't. He left. Colt sat at the back table after he was gone and drank the rest of his coffee and looked at the empty space where the photographs had been arranged and thought about Nora in that bedroom with 4 minutes and a flip phone and the particular calm of someone doing a necessary thing. He had been thinking about a conversation he needed to have. Had been turning its shape over since the night Desmond told him the building had sold to Meridian. Had been finding reasons to delay it because delay was occasionally useful and occasionally just the face fear wore when it dressed in strategic clothing. He picked up his phone. Howard Calloway's office was on the 14th floor of a building on South High Street that made every possible visual argument for the solidity of the enterprise within. Heavy glass doors, a lobby with marble floors, a receptionist who had clearly been selected partly for the capacity to communicate through posture alone, that unscheduled visitors were an oversight bordering on rudeness. Colt was not unscheduled. He had called ahead. He had given his name. He had said he needed 30 minutes with Howard Calloway regarding a property matter. The receptionist had been told something by Howard's assistant and had come back to the phone with the particular cadence of someone conveying an answer they did not fully understand. Mr. Calloway could see him Thursday at 2. Colt had said that would work. He sat now in a chair on the 14th floor waiting. The chair was designed to communicate the value of the time of the person you were waiting for, which was a choice of furniture Colt found more informative than intimidating. He looked at the Akron skyline through the window across from him, the city's specific silhouette, the old rubber industry buildings repurposed, nor abandoned the new glass structures that had arrived in the last decade with the insistence of people who had decided on revival without fully consulting the city about the terms. Howard Calloway appeared at 2:07, which was a specific message in itself. He was in his office clothes, the good suit, the authority posture, but there was something slightly effortful about the assembly, the way you could tell when someone has dressed for a performance they weren't sure they were ready to give. He led Colt into his office, sat behind the desk. Colt took the chair across from it and did not wait. Your mother's not going to sign the termination agreement, Colt said. Howard's hands settled on the desktop. Mr. Hargrove, she's not going to sign it because the notice that preceded it is legally void. Her lease falls under the 2014 Ohio Tenant Protection Amendments. The protections those amendments provide attach automatically to any long-term lease signed before the effective date. They cannot be waived by a subsequent property sale, a change of management, or any pressure campaign against the tenant. Colt kept his voice level. Meridian knew this when they acquired the building, which means the entire strategy, placing Glenn Pruitt, escalating the situation, generating the Voss filing, was built on forcing your mother to vacate voluntarily before she understood she had rights that couldn't be taken from her. And the attorney who instructed that filing knew it was unenforceable from the first day it was drafted. He looked directly at Howard. You drafted her original lease in 2012. You know what the 2014 amendments cover. You knew this notice wouldn't survive a challenge. This was never a legal strategy. It was a pressure campaign, and it had your initials on the instruction. The room held a specific silence. Howard looked at the window, at the city he'd built a career in while his mother worked double shifts 2 neighborhoods over. He looked at it with the expression of a man who has maintained a certain version of a story for a long time and is now watching it become insufficient. I had no direct involvement with what happened at the building, he said. Glenn Pruitt was Meridian's arrangement, not mine. Your initials are on the filing instruction. I supervised the legal work. The approach was Meridian's. That distinction won't survive a deposition, Colt said, and it won't matter to Edna. Howard looked at him directly for the first time since they'd sat down. What do you want, he said. Colt had thought carefully about what he wanted, had sat with it for 3 days, had walked around it from every direction. I want Meridian to withdraw the notice, he said. I want a signed covenant that Edna Calloway's tenancy at the Riverside Arms will not be challenged, harassed, or subject to any further legal action during the remaining term of her lease. I want this completed within 3 weeks. He paused. After that, your involvement in this matter ends. Completely. Howard looked at the desk, at the clean surface of it, the organized evidence of a professional life. And if I don't? Colt didn't answer immediately. He let the question sit in the room the way it deserved to. Then he said, I have photographs of the Voss filing documents. I have the building log that shows no noise complaint was ever formally recorded. I have a timeline that maps Glenn Pruitt's placement at the Riverside Arms to the week before Meridian's purchase was recorded. He paused. I also have 3 similar properties in Akron where the same pattern was used against other tenants who didn't know their rights. That information is already with people whose job it is to find it useful. Howard said nothing. I'm not interested in pursuing you personally beyond this, Colt said. This is not about what you did to Edna as her son. That's between you and whatever you live with. I'm interested in the specific legal protection of a specific tenant in a specific building. That's all. He stood. Howard stood as well reflexively, the social programming of his profession overriding his calculation. She won't forgive you, Colt said. It was not said with malice. It was said with the specific weight of someone who has first-hand knowledge of how time works on certain things. That's not what I'm asking you to understand. I'm asking you to understand that she doesn't need to. She's going to be fine without the forgiveness to conversation. She's going to go home to her apartment and plant things on her windowsills and drink her coffee and watch her granddaughter do extraordinary things and be exactly who she has always been. He looked at Howard Calloway, at the suit, the office, the careful assembly of a life that had required leaving certain people behind to construct. The question is what you do with that. He left the office and walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood looking at the closed doors. He had said what there was to say. The rest was Howard's to carry. Carver Oaks received Meridian's withdrawal notification on a Tuesday, 18 days after the first meeting at the club. It came through their Columbus registered attorney with the specific language of a legal document that wants to close a matter without creating additional record of the matter being worth closing. Oaks read it twice, confirmed all required elements were present, and sent Colt a text that contained 3 words signed, sealed, done. Colt was in the parking lot of St. Augustine Hospital when it arrived. Edna was being discharged that morning. 2 weeks and 4 days after the night on the kitchen floor, she was going home. The doctor had cleared her the previous day with the specific instructions of a man who knows his patient well enough to understand that she will follow some of the instructions and apply her own judgment to the rest. Nora had come with Desmond in the early morning. She had brought Edna's good coat, the gray wool one that lived on the hook by the apartment door, and Edna's second best shoes because the best ones were for church, and this didn't qualify. She had packed a bag with the things Edna had accumulated in the hospital room, the spare glasses, the books, the small framed photograph that Nora had brought on day 3 from the bedside table at home, and that Edna had placed on the hospital windowsill to look at when the yellow-white light became too much of itself. The photograph was of the 2 of them at a park. Summer from the look of the light, Edna in her good hat, and Nora with a dripping popsicle, both of them with enormous smiles. When the wheelchair arrived, Edna made her position on wheelchairs clear, in terms that the orderly handled with the professional grace of someone who had heard this speech before. A brief negotiation resulted in Edna using the wheelchair to the elevator and walking the rest of the way. They came out of the main entrance into the October air 3 weeks now, since the first night, the autumn having settled fully into its gray and gold register, the trees on the hospital grounds in the particular late stage of fall, where the remaining color is the most saturated, briefly perfect, before the end. Edna stopped just outside the door. She lifted her face to the air. She had been inside for 17 days. The outside was doing something specific to her, the specific thing outside does to people who have been kept from it, the full-body acknowledgement of space and air, and the ordinary world continuing without pause. Nora stood beside her and did not say anything. She understood in the way she understood most things that this was not a moment that required words. Colt was at the curb, not Desmond. Colt with the black SUV and the engine running and the door already open, because some things you did yourself. Edna looked at him. Something in her expression that was not surprise, exactly more like the recognition of a thing that has arranged itself correctly. The apartment's ready, Colt said. So I hear, Edna said. She walked to the car. The drive home was 20 minutes in the mid-morning Akron traffic. Nora sat in the back beside Edna and gave a precise and organized account of the changes to the apartment in the tone of someone delivering a prepared briefing. New table, new chairs. The window drafts were fixed, the lamp in the corner. She reported these facts with the careful attention of someone who wants the recipient to know exactly what to expect, so that the arrival can be an arrival rather than a survey. She did not mention the legal situation. Colt had told her that morning that the withdrawal was signed. Nora had nodded with the focused satisfaction of someone whose analysis has been confirmed. She had not asked for more detail. She trusted the result. What she did mention in the careful tone she used when raising subjects she had considered in advance. "There's something I want to show you when we get home, something I found in the drawer." Edna looked at her. "Which drawer?" "The one in your nightstand, the one you always lock." "I didn't open it," Nora added quickly. "It came open when Whitfield moved the nightstand to replace the lamp. The lock must have given." She looked at the front seat at Colt's profile. "There was an envelope inside. I put it back. I didn't read it." She paused. "But I saw the name on it." The car was very quiet. "What name?" Edna said. Nora said it carefully, Pearl Hargrove. Colt's hands did not move on the wheel. The SUV continued through the intersection at Commerce and Fifth with the same steady momentum. Everything external stayed the same, but the air inside the car changed in the precise way air changes when something important has been named. Edna looked at her hands in her lap, at the window, at the middle distance of someone deciding. "When we get home," she said finally. "Yes." The apartment was everything Nora had described and something more, the way places become more than the sum of their changes when they are returned to after absence. Edna stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time, not cataloging, but feeling the particular quality of a space that has been cared for, that someone has put hands to with attention. The small plants on the windowsills were healthy. Someone had watered them throughout. This was the detail that got to her, that made her put one hand briefly on the counter and look out the south window at the November morning. Not the furniture, or the lamp, or the weather stripping. The plants. Nora appeared beside her, handed her a cup of coffee she had started at the moment they walked in the specific first task of homecoming. Edna held it, looked at the kitchen table new but fitting the space as if it had always been there. Looked at the refrigerator where the drawing was still held by the same four magnets untouched. She went to the nightstand. The lock had given in the way old locks do, not dramatically, just the accumulated give of years, finally expressing itself, the mechanism releasing its hold on something it had been keeping for a long time. The envelope was where Nora had said, face up, the name written in a hand that Edna recognized the way you recognize the handwriting of people who have been important to you. The specific slant, the particular way certain letters resolved. Pearl Hargrove, 11 years in a locked drawer. Edna carried it to the kitchen table. Colt was still in the doorway of the apartment. He had come up with them, but had stopped at the threshold in the way of a man who understood the difference between being included and being presumptuous. He was leaning against the door frame with his hands in his pockets, looking at the hallway rather than the room. Edna looked at him. "Come sit down," she said. He came in. He took the chair across from Edna at the new kitchen table. Nora stood beside her grandmother. The morning light came through the south window in its long, warm stripe across the table, falling across the envelope. Edna opened it. It was 2 pages handwritten on the kind of plain stationery you buy at a drugstore, lined with a faint blue grid. The handwriting was deliberate in the specific way of someone who has taken care over each word, not because the mechanics of writing were difficult, but because the words themselves required the care. Edna read it silently first. Her face moved with it, not dramatically, just the subtle, continuous adjustment of a face receiving specific information. When she finished, she held it for a moment. Then she looked at Colt. "She wrote this the week before her final admission," Edna said. "She knew she was going in and she was not certain she was coming back out." She smoothed the pages on the table with the flat of her hand. "She wrote it to me because she said she didn't have an address for you." A pause. "She said she'd lost the last address she had and was afraid that by the time she tried to find a new one, it would be too late." Colt was looking at the table. His jaw was set in the way of someone exerting specific control over something specific. "She asked me to find you," Edna said. "If I ever could. She wrote, if you ever meet my grandson," she described you, what you looked like, your name, "please tell him that I knew he was doing the best he could, that I understood why he couldn't come, that I was not angry." Edna stopped. She wrote that the thing she wanted him to know most was that she folded the laundry herself on the last Tuesday morning before she went in, that she found it clarifying as always, that she thought of him while she did it. The kitchen held its silence. The light moved slightly as a cloud passed outside. I kept it, Edna said. I kept it because I believed I would find a way to deliver it. I tried a few times over the years. The name meant something in this neighborhood, but not in the way that made it easy to walk up and say, I have a letter for you. I let the years go. She looked at Colt. I'm sorry it took so long. Colt had gone very still. Not the operational stillness he used to manage rooms. Something else. Something prior to management beneath it. He said nothing for a moment. The kitchen kept its quiet. Nora was still beside Edna, not moving, reading the room with those steady eyes. Then Colt said she folded her own laundry. His voice was not entirely level. Yes, Edna said. On the last Tuesday. Yes. He reached out, and Edna placed the pages in his hands. He held them the way you hold something you did not expect to touch, not tightly, just in contact, feeling the paper. His eyes moved over the handwriting, Pearl's specific slant, her particular letters, her voice in whatever way a hand gives the impression of a voice. He read it, all of it, slowly. When he finished, he folded the pages once along the original crease and held them in his palm. He was quiet for a long time, and Edna and Nora gave him that time without any of the discomfort that silence sometimes creates, because both of them understood in their own ways that this particular silence was doing necessary work. Nora moved quietly to the counter and refilled the coffees. She set one in front of Colt without asking. He looked at it, looked at her. Something crossed his face, the full, complicated weight of the morning, the letter, the light in the kitchen. This child who kept showing up exactly where she needed to be with exactly what was needed. Thank you, he said. Nora sat back in her chair and said nothing. The legal formalization of Edna's position took the remaining days of November. Oakes moved with the focused efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of case, the kind where the law actually said what it should and just needed someone to hold it up clearly in good light. The withdrawal was formal, documented, and accompanied by a covenant that Oakes described as using language that was for Colt's benefit, not a legal brief, airtight. Meridian's pattern across the 4 Akron properties became the subject of a federal investigation that Colt had no official connection to, which was the arrangement that served everyone's actual interests. Glenn Pruitt did not return to Akron. Colt had made arrangements to be informed if this changed. He had not told Edna about these arrangements, and Edna had not asked because part of an arrangement with a man like Colt was understanding which questions had answers you could use and which had answers that served you better as silence. Howard Calloway called his mother in the 3rd week of November. The conversation was brief by Edna's account. He had said he was sorry. Edna had said she heard him. They had not agreed on what came next, which was its own kind of progress, the acknowledgement of a territory that hadn't been entered before, even if the entering would take time. Edna reported this to Nora with the specific calm of a woman who has stopped waiting for something that hurt and is learning slowly to hold it differently. Nora said, "Did you tell him about me?" Edna said, "He knows about you." Nora thought about this. Does he know I know about the noise complaint that doesn't exist? Edna looked at her. No. Nora considered. Maybe keep that for later, she said. Edna had taken a moment before she said, "You're going to be a very formidable person when you grow up." Nora had said reasonably, "I'm formidable now." She was not wrong. The Sunday dinner was Edna's idea, which meant it was a decision rather than a suggestion. She announced it on a Thursday dinner on Sunday, 4 o'clock, the good tablecloth, Colt and Desmond. She said this to Colt directly on the phone with the specific no-negotiation energy of a woman who has decided that something is going to happen and is merely providing information rather than seeking consent. Colt said he would be there. He arrived at 4 exactly. He brought nothing. Desmond, who had more social calibration in some directions, had brought a bottle of wine and a box of bakery cookies that Nora accepted with the focused evaluation of someone assessing quality. The apartment smelled of everything Edna had been building toward for 2 weeks, the specific layered warmth of a kitchen that has been working for hours, something with chicken and something with cream, and the particular foundation note of good bread. It was a small kitchen in a small apartment in a neighborhood the city had largely forgotten, and it contained in that moment more warmth than most rooms Colt had stood in all his years of standing in rooms. Edna moved between the stove and the counter with the economy of a woman who has cooked in this specific space for 11 years and knows its every dimension in her body. She was still moving carefully. The ribs were not finished with their opinion, but she had declined all offers of help with the particular authority of someone for whom cooking is not a task but a language, and to help would be to interrupt a sentence. Desmond sat at the kitchen counter with a glass of wine and asked Nora about her library book, which had been finished and replaced with a new one, and listened with the genuine attention of someone who had, over the preceding weeks, developed a specific regard for the mind of this child. Nora explained the new book's premise with the organized precision she brought to all explanations. Premise central question what she thought about it so far. Desmond asked a follow-up question that demonstrated he had been listening. Nora gave it serious consideration before answering. Colt stood near the south window. He was doing the thing he sometimes did when he was processing rather than participating, present in the room but with some of himself still working on something. He held his glass and looked at the light coming through the south window, which was the particular low light of late November, thinner and more horizontal than October's falling across the table at a longer angle. Edna came to stand beside him. They stood together for a moment, looking at the kitchen, at Nora and Desmond, at the counter, at the ordinary business of a late Sunday afternoon. "She talks about you at school," Edna said. Colt looked at her. "Her teacher told me." Edna kept her eyes on the room. "Apparently there was an assignment. Someone who is important to you and why." A pause. "She wrote about you." He was quiet. "She wrote, and I'm told this is a direct quote, that you're important because you are a good man who had to figure it out the hard way, and that figuring things out the hard way doesn't mean you're bad, it means the easy way wasn't available to you." The kitchen continued around them, the smell of dinner. Nora laughing at something Desmond had said with the full, unguarded laugh of a child who trusts where she is. "That's an 8-year-old, Colt said. "That's this 8-year-old, Edna said. She went back to the stove. Colt stood at the window a moment longer. He took out his phone and looked at it, not at any message, just holding it the way you hold something when you're deciding whether to do the thing you've been deciding about for a while. He put the phone away. He went to the counter instead and stood beside Nora and told her he heard she'd finished the book. Nora turned to him with the immediate directness she always brought to conversations she cared about. "The ending was wrong," she said. "Wrong how?" "The character made the right choice, but for the wrong reason. He did the good thing because he was afraid of the consequences of the bad thing. That's not the same as actually choosing." Colt picked up a bread roll from the basket Edna had set out. "What's the difference?" Nora thought about it for a moment. "One is about what happens to you. The other is about who you are." She looked at him. "You're not afraid of consequences." "How do you know?" "Because the night I came to Garfield Street, you didn't ask what would happen to you if you helped me. You just got up and came." She looked back at the counter. "That's the difference." Colt stood with the bread roll in his hand and said nothing. Desmond was looking at the window with the expression of a man who had decided to be somewhere else in his attention. The timer on the stove went off. Dinner was served at a 4:45. The good tablecloth, as announced. Edna's specific china, the ivory set with the blue edge that she'd had since her wedding and used for occasions that warranted it. The overhead light and the lamp in the corner, both on the way Nora preferred. 4 people around the table in the small kitchen in the Riverside Arms. There was an unspoken geometry to the seating. The table had 4 sides. There was the seat at the head, the position of authority of the person who presides, of the one whose function is to manage rather than to belong. And there were the other 3. Nora sat in her usual chair, the one with the view of the south window. Desmond took the chair across from her. Edna sat at the head because she had made the food and because this was her home, and that was simply correct. Colt looked at the remaining chair. It was beside Nora, just beside her at the table, not at any particular position of authority or oversight or management. He sat down. Nora passed him the bread basket without being asked, the way you pass things to people who belong at your table. Edna had made everything from memory, from the recipes that lived in her hands rather than in any book: the chicken, the potatoes, the green beans, with the specific seasonings she had never written down because it had never needed to be written. It just was what it was. She served it the way she served everything, without fanfare, without the performance of generosity. Just the clean and direct act of putting food in front of people who were going to eat it. The conversation moved the way good dinner conversation does not, with a destination, just with the current of 4 people comfortable enough to follow whatever came up. Desmond told a story about his uncle that was apparently famous enough in Akron to require no setup. Nora asked Edna to tell the story about the time she'd won the spelling bee in 1964, because Nora had heard it 12 times and always asked for it again, which was the specific honor children pay to stories they love. Edna told it, and it got bigger in a certain place the way it always did, and everyone knew it got bigger and nobody corrected it because that was what the story was for. At some point, Nora said, I have something to tell you. The table quieted. I finished the proposal, she said, for the school project, the one about the building. Colt looked at her. What building? This building, Nora said. We had a civic engagement assignment. We were supposed to identify a problem in our community and propose a solution. She reached down beside her chair and produced a folder that she had apparently been sitting on, which was such a specific Nora action that Desmond smiled into his glass. She placed it on the table. I wrote about housing protections for elderly residents in urban neighborhoods with expiring lease agreements. I used our building as the case study. She looked at Colt. I didn't use your name. I used a local advocate for your part. My teacher said it was the best proposal she'd seen in 9 years of the assignment. She put the folder back beside her chair. I'm presenting it at the district civic forum in February, she said, conversationally, like this was a thing that happened. Edna looked at her. You didn't tell me about the forum. I was going to tell you on a Sunday, Nora said, when everyone was together. The table held a particular quiet, the kind that contains something full, something that has more in it than its surface suggests. Then Colt said, I'll be there. Nora looked at him. At the forum, he said, in February. You don't have to. I know, he said. She looked at him for a moment, deciding in the way she always decided whether she believed a thing before she accepted it. Then she reached for the bread basket and held it out to him. He took a roll. Dinner continued. After the dishes and the bakery cookies and the particular contented slowing that comes at the end of a meal, when nowhere else is pressing, Desmond offered to help with the kitchen in a way that Edna rebuffed on principle, but then partly accepted, which was its own form of welcome. They moved in the kitchen together while Nora went to the couch with her new library book and the lamp she liked. Colt went out to the hallway. Just into the hallway, the door left open to make a call he had been not quite making for 3 weeks. It was brief. It involved a name and address and an instruction. The recipient of the call asked no questions that were not logistical. The call ended. Colt stood in the hallway of the Riverside Arms, the old carpet, the water stain on the ceiling, near the stairs, the building's particular smell of decades of people living honestly in a constrained space, and thought about what he was doing. Not the call specifically, the larger thing. He had spent 20 years building something in East Side Akron, something that operated in the spaces the city's official structures had vacated, something that kept certain kinds of violence contained and certain kinds of predation off the streets and certain people with no other recourse from finding themselves entirely without options. He was not sentimental about what it was. He did not call it good. He called it what it was, a particular kind of order maintained by a particular kind of person through means that the law did not endorse. He had not expected in the middle of it to become someone that a child would write about in a school project, had not expected to be described by an 8-year-old as a good man who had to figure it out the hard way, had not expected at 42 to sit beside a child at a dinner table and feel what it felt like to simply be one of the people at the table. He went back inside. Nora was on the couch, book open, the lamp making a warm circle around her. She looked up when he came in. Before you go, she said, I want to show you something. He came and stood near the couch. She reached into her backpack. It was beside the couch, always within reach. The battered thing she'd had the night she ran, and she pulled out a piece of paper folded once. She unfolded it and held it out. It was a photocopy, a legal document. Colt took it and read it. It was a certificate of organization for a limited liability company registered with the Ohio Secretary of State. The organization date was the previous Tuesday. The registered agent was Carver Oakes' firm. The company name at the top of the document read Pearl Sparrow LLC. Colt looked at the paper for a long moment. Desmond told me, Nora said, when he drove me to school on Tuesday, he said he thought you were going to tell me, but that maybe you were still deciding how. She looked at him with the clear, steady eyes. He said one name was for your grandmother and one was for mine. Colt folded the paper along its crease and held it. It's the right name, Nora said. He didn't answer for a moment. He looked at the paper, at the window, at the lamp's warm circle around this child on the couch. Your grandmother never told me her maiden name, he said. How did you know her name was Sparrow? Nora looked at him with the expression she had when something was obvious. She has a framed embroidery above her bed, Nora said. It says Edna Sparrow Calloway. She made it herself in 1974. Colt looked at her. I read things, Nora said simply, and returned to her book. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, one for Pearl, one for Edna. Yes, Nora said, and the LLC holds title to this building. I know, she said. Desmond explained it. The company owns the building. Grandma owns her lease. Both protected. She turned a page. It's a good structure. He looked at this child who had photographed documents in the dark and read the embroidery above her grandmother's bed and written a civic engagement proposal that would be presented at a district forum and asked strangers if they were good or bad men, and always already knew the answer. He said, Nora. She looked up. I haven't answered your question, he said. From the first night, she looked at him with the patience of someone who had been prepared to wait as long as the answer took. I don't know if I'm a good man, he said. I've done things I won't tell you about. I've made choices I can't take back. I don't think the accounting ever fully resolves. He paused. But I think I'm trying to be the right thing in the right place. And I think you were right that night the easy way wasn't available to me. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. Nora looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. That's what I wrote in the project. He stood with the paper in his hands and looked at her. Then he looked at the kitchen where Edna and Desmond were finishing the dishes, the sound of water running and quiet conversation, and the ordinary functional warmth of people in a shared space. He thought about Pearl Hargrove folding laundry on a Tuesday morning, finding it clarifying, thinking of him while she did it. He thought about what it meant that the world had been small enough and long enough and strange enough to put all of it here. This kitchen, this building, this name on a corporate document, this child on a couch with a library book who had run across the city in the dark on purpose towards something she'd already decided about. He went back to the kitchen. He stood beside Edna at the counter and dried the dishes she handed him. Because some things did not require explanation, they just required doing the way certain kinds of meaning work, the way belonging works, not through declaration, but through the accumulation of ordinary acts, acts performed in the right direction. The dish Edna handed him was one of the ivory plates with the blue edge. He dried it and set it on the stack. She handed him another. The November dark was full outside the south window. Inside the lamp was on and the kitchen was warm, and the building that had stood on Garfield Street since 1964 held an apartment 4C, the specific and unrepeatable way to 4 people at the end of a Sunday with nowhere else they needed to be.